Hello and welcome to another Lewisburg Community TV video and another episode here from the shop in Tertulia. We're closed again, but we are still reading books and selling books online on our website tertuliabookshop.com. And so today we've got a lovely interview which I did online with Laura McKenna. Her book Words to Shape My Name has just come out this week, so we're going to be talking about that in a while. In the meantime, we've had lots of new books have come out this month, and Neil, you're reading a couple of sort of topical books.
Well, at the moment I'm reading A People's Tragedy by Orlando Fleece, and that's it's a 100th anniversary edition. So it's about the Russian Revolution, of course, and kind of topical because there's a kind of another revolution going on at the moment.
Well,
and what's interesting about this is a good friend of mine in London is his cousin. So hopefully we'll have Orlando coming to visit us when we open up, maybe later on in the year or next year. I don't know, whenever.
And how much time? What's the time span of the book?
It goes from the 1800s up until the revolution itself, so it's 20-30 years. So I know I'm only halfway through, so there's a lot more to go. But anyhow, what about you, Brid?
Well, I actually have just finished this book, Words to Shape My Name, and Laura, we're going to hand you over to Laura in a moment. But there's some other interesting books come in. This one, Thin Places, also came in this week. Kerry Need Doherty. This is her own book about sort of wilderness and healing and nature, and I haven't read it yet. It's just come in yesterday, but I've already sold a few copies, so it promises to be a gorgeous book, and it's hailed as one of the great books of this year so far. Another book I ordered, again, which has just come in, Thought Economics, and this is kind of relevant because we're having our first Philosopher's Hat Club tonight. We're starting. We've another event tomorrow night. And this, I suppose, is about the great thinkers of our time, artists, economists. So, yeah, this book is about conversations with a range of people. So,
who's that by?
It is Vikas Shah, and it's actually got a foreword by Lem Sisse, who wrote a book himself about his experiences in London growing up as a boy of race. So that's that book. And as we're doing philosophy, this is Nigel Warburton. We've talked about this book before, actually, A Little History of Philosophy. But Nigel is going to come on our Philosopher's Hat Club on the 4th of March. It's a Zoom online session. It's 1 hour. It's free, actually, next month. And we're just going to talk about some of the issues he's raised in his book and about the history of philosophy. So that's kind of what we're doing at the moment. So we're doing philosophy and books, eating and walking. That's kind of our lives at the moment. So we're going to hand you over to Laura. This book is historical fiction. It is most unusual. It's about the late 1700s in Ireland, and I'm going to hand you over to Laura and myself, and we'll come back to you in a minute. So hi, Laura, and we have here today in Tertulia, we have Laura McKenna, who's joining us from Cork. Isn't that right? You're in
That's
Cork?
Right, yes, yeah.
And I believe your background is child psychiatry.
That's right.
And you did a PhD, which I'm very envious of, in creative writing. And this book, which we're going to talk about today, Words to Shape My Name, was part of that PhD. Am I understanding that right?
Right, yes, it was, yeah.
And it was nominated for the Bath Novel Awards, and also the Book Fair Award.
Long listed for the Bath Novel Award, yeah, and one of the winners at the Novel Fair.
At the Novel, yes, so fantastic already. Now it's coming out, we know, in the next Words to Shape My Name by Laura McKenna, and it's coming out in the next week or so. We're waiting on the books to arrive. And I've just finished it this morning.
Oh, have you? Oh, great.
So I guess originally I was fascinated because I do read a lot of historical fiction. It's probably my favorite kind of book to read. And this is set in that time in the late 1700s. And I guess it's a time where we know a little bit about from history when we were at school, but maybe have forgotten about. So it's most unusual in that it talks about, is it Lord Edward Fitzgerald, who was part of the United Irishmen, and also he freed a slave. So that's kind of the opening. So maybe you could just tell us about this story. I mean, it's a big story. There's a lot in it. I found a lot. There's so many characters and a lot going on, and based at that time in Ireland, when things were beginning to change we were beginning to turn to rebellion and to think about a different way of living. So why this story, I suppose? What was it about it that you loved to write about?
Well, I mean, the inspiration for the story came from reading Stella Tilliard's biography of Fitzgerald, Citizen Lord. And that is a number of, I wouldn't want to say how long ago that is, but I was fascinated by both the story of Fitzgerald himself. He's a very interesting character. And Stella Tilliard's biography really puts that across. It's kind of an exciting biography, there's a real narrative in it, and and a really good insight into the characters. But she also highlighted the role of Tony Small, and this is the man who was actually an escaped slave. He had done his own freeing himself by the time he met Fitzgerald, and he saved him from the battlefield at Utah Springs during the American War of Independence. And from then on, they were kind of companions. He was manservant to Fitzgerald, and they had a relationship for, I suppose, 17 years, and that relationship changed over those years. And I was really interested in this Tony Small and what it must have been like for him to come to Ireland. And I suppose I had a lot of assumptions about what Ireland would have been like in those times, which fueled my interest. How would he have fit in, etc. And I was very interested too that at the end of Tilliard's biography, she talks about Tony Small, what happened to him after Fitzgerald's death. She wonders about his children's children walking the streets of London unknown. That's kind of the end of the book. And she really gave and of course I just wanted to know myself what did happen. And that was the start of it. It was that kind of, I wonder if I could find something out. And then it went from that sort of curiosity about the man himself to thinking, gosh, there's a real story in there about this man and how it was for him in Ireland, on the edges of of 3 revolutions. It's kind of remarkable that he went from America and then ended up kind of on the tail end of the French Revolution, and then of course this 1798 rebellion. So it is a big story, like you said.
It is, and you are taken, as you said, you start off in those Carolinas, and then you're taken on the travels, because they also did a lot of traveling together, didn't they? The two of them before they got in, before they actually came back to Ireland and to England. Yeah. So it was. I loved the way you told Tony Small, the slave. You told his story through him writing. I suppose writing a memoir really of what had happened, so you chose that kind of medium for Tony to tell his story.
Yes, and that was something I had thought of early, because I'd read some of those early slave narratives that were around at that time. I suppose Equiano, who his book is referenced in the novel, but he was probably the most famous, but there were many of them, and these stories were used by the abolitionist movement to, I suppose, give people awareness of what was happening. So I had this idea that Tony would be almost coerced into writing it. And the idea behind that was he was going to he should restore the reputation of Lord Edward Fitzgerald, who at that time had been declared a traitor and his lands and property confiscated. So that's sort of the premise in the novel for this formal narrative, which Tony writes. But then, I thought, I didn't just want that to be Tony's voice. That was very constrained. And so hence there's the other narrative thread running through it, which is more to the real story.
Yeah. I liked that. So you had that narrative, and then yes, it's like he drops out of that narrative every now and then, which one would in reality, and then starts to tell the story in his own head, and it works really well. It really does. So how, I suppose that the book is centered a lot around Edward and Tony, but the other characters too. So you did a lot of work on them too. So we learn a lot about his wife, about Tony's wife, about his sister Lucy, and perhaps her role in everything that happened. So yes, how did you kind of choose which ones you were going to include in the book, or what was going to be, what was part of the story?
I'd say they largely chose themselves. certainly the other narrative thread, which belongs to Tony's daughter, Harriet. I mean, she very much chose herself. She was never meant to be in the novel. And I had done some research and found some records, which is unusual, I think, because, you know, not many of us leave too many traces, but there was a couple of records about her and something about her voice. You know, she's very verbose and kind of feisty, and she kind of demanded her place. And I just thought she was a very interesting character, and interesting to show, I suppose. You know, often the histories are just about the one person, and then this daughter of Tony's, who was of mixed race, I thought it would be interesting to show what her life was like and how his, you know, what had happened to him, the impact of that on her life too. So that's how she got in.
And she starts with her. It starts with her, doesn't it? And well, it starts and ends with her, doesn't it? Yeah,
that's right.
The first part is a journey to St. Mary's graveyard in 1857, and it's her, isn't it, going to the graveyard?
Yes.
Yeah, she was a very strong voice. And I wondered if there was another story for her. Is there another?
I think Harriet could well have her own story. Yeah, she'd a lot to say. Yeah. So she is sort of a contrast to her father, who would have been much more restrained and careful and watchful. But Harriet has none of that. She's very out there and outspoken. Yeah, she would have her own story. I suppose her story is compressed in it, but it is there. Yeah.
Oh no, it is there. Yeah. And I suppose there were so many themes. Yeah. So apart from the traveling, you took us on many journeys to many different places, but also the themes that are in there, and yet, you know, they're from the late 1700s, but they're still so relevant today. Really, you know, you have the issue of, well, I suppose they were fighting for male suffragette, I suppose, is what they wanted, isn't it? They wanted Ireland to have a voice, and they wanted, and equally Tony to have his voice as well. But there's so many issues of race, or, you know, you cover them a lot in the book as well. And you mentioned about Dublin in that time, what it would have been like for someone, you know, to be of colour in Ireland at that time. So yeah, I suppose just maybe to say some more about that, how you wove those themes into the story.
I mean, that's a bit, you know, when you're writing, you kind of, I suppose I became aware of them.
Yeah.
That they weren't so much deliberately woven in. For example, identity was important, like you mentioned there, and names were important, but that's because that came up by itself. So I suppose maybe I was tuning into it and paying attention to the role of names, and for example, what Tony was called at the beginning and how that changed towards the end. And then that reflected in real life. He was sort of poor Tony, or at the very beginning, and then he became faithful Tony, and then he was Mr. Small, and by the end he was Mr. Anthony Small, and that was of his own doing. That's how he signed his letter at the end, you know. So yes, identity was important. The issue of race and how things were in Ireland at the time was actually an interesting one, because again, that I suppose I had an assumption that he would have been largely alone in this strange country of white people. But of course, it wasn't the case. It wasn't homogenous. There were other Black people, and in similar roles as himself for the most part. But yeah, that was quite an interesting thing to discover. So he wouldn't have been alone in Dublin at that time, or in many of the other ports. I'm aware of sunshine here in my face. Sorry. I'm going to move myself a bit.
Oh, wow. And the issues, I suppose, another theme was there, wasn't it? It's about creating an equal society, you know, and that comes into its own at the end of the book as well, where, you know, where that voice comes over. And I thought, my God, you know, this was the late 1700s, and this is still, in a sense, a battle that's still being fought in all sorts of ways in the world today. So yeah, I suppose you begin that story, or how it was at that time.
But yeah, and that was interesting, and I found even I kind of included it then in the novel, The Oath of the United Irishmen. It was very sort of holistic and inclusive, and of all religions, you know, and men of all backgrounds. Of course, it was men.
Well, yes, we didn't even begin to talk about women.
Too far at that stage, but even still, even within that movement, there were those who felt, you know, that the position of women ought to be improved as well. But of course, their voices weren't quite heard enough or loud enough. But yes, that it was interesting, that about suffrage and equality, you know, that equitable kind of sense. That was very much part of Fitzgerald's philosophy, and had been for a number of years.
Yeah, and I suppose yesterday was the inauguration, wasn't it, of Biden, and he was still talking about those issues. It was quite funny because I'm trying to finish the book and then listen to Biden. I'm going, hello, some of those things he's talking about, are, you know, were talked about in the 1780s in Ireland and many other places. Yeah.
Yes, yes, and names and identity, they're all so very much relevant today.
Yeah.
And all the leftovers, in fact, from this era of slavery, still so relevant.
Yeah, and I suppose what I loved about it too was that it was such an Irish story. You know, I suppose that to read this kind of historical fiction about events that were actually really important in our, you know, in our near history, really.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it was wonderful that you chose this, you know, this topic to write such a great book. So yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Very, very.
It was a delight to write it.
Yeah.
I love that combination of history and the characters themselves, and they were very interesting people. So, you know, it was a lovely thing to do.
And did you have a favorite out of those characters?
Oh, I changed all the time, because the more I found out and got to know them, the more real they became, you know. And often they didn't match up to the brief kind of you know, the sketch you get of them, like Pamela. I'm not sure really what I thought of Pamela before, but I did find out that, you know, she had a great sense of humor. She was very funny and witty. And Lucy herself, Edward's sister, was very passionate about Irish independence as well. She was very caught up in it, as was Pamela. They were both working away in the background to support that movement. You know, they didn't get a lot of credit for it. In fact,
no, you cover that really well. Yes, you could hear their voices in there and the role that they played. Yeah. Oh, and any plans then for the future, or any?
I have another book that I've started, historical again, even though I said, you know, the other took so long to write. I kind of thought, but I've just had to realize that I love the history, and I love finding out things, and, you know, people who aren't so well known in particular. So that's kind of, it's another novel set slightly, it's sort of the 1800s this time. And it's a woman is the main character in this one. So
oh, good.
Yeah.
Oh, so you're looking forward to the book coming out?
Oh, I'm really looking forward to coming out. I can't believe you have the actual. I'm dying to get my hands on it, actually. See it.
Yeah, and you'll be able to come and do talks and promote it in a while. We hope soon, very soon.
Oh, I would hope so. It would be lovely to be able to do that, I must say. But anyway, sure, you know, this medium is lovely too.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll see you in Westport sometime when we are open again.
I have never been to Westport, so there you go. I would love to see it.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Laura. Good luck with the book,
really.
and we're looking forward to having them in the shop.
Thank you, and I will get there as soon as I can.
Okay.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, and we look forward to selling many copies of your book in the shop and meeting Laura when we can.
Yeah.
So yeah, check out our website. We have lots of new books we're putting up all the time: fiction, non-fiction, sport,
you name it.
Philosophy. There's really is a lot of nice books coming out in the next few months. I think the publishers were hanging on, weren't they, to see what happened, and now they're just pushing them all out. So there's some really good ones coming out. So watch this space. Take care. Bye bye.